My uncle stole my inheritance and left me homeless, but what he didn't know was that I had copies of every document he forged. After 20 years of building my veterinary practice, I thought family meant something. When he manipulated my dying grandmother into changing her will, he destroyed everything I believed in. Now, watching him celebrate his newfound wealth, I realize some betrayals demand a reckoning that goes far beyond forgiveness. I am Dr. Sophia Chen, a 33-year-old veterinary surgeon in Portland, Oregon. For the past decade, I've poured my heart and soul into building the most respected animal hospital in the Pacific Northwest. My grandmother, Eleanor, had always promised that her sprawling estate in the hills would be mine, not just because I was her favorite grandchild, but because I was the only one who never asked her for money, never treated her like a walking inheritance. I visited her every Sunday, bringing her stories about the animals I saved and listening to her tales of surviving the Great Depression. She was my anchor, my moral compass, and the only family member I truly trusted. That trust shattered on a cold November morning when her lawyer called to inform me that Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Through my tears, I barely registered his next words. The estate, worth over $2 million, had been left entirely to my uncle, Marcus, her youngest son who hadn't spoken to her in 5 years. Marcus Chen had always been the family disappointment. At 45, he'd burned through 3 marriages, countless jobs, and every bit of goodwill our extended family had ever shown him. He was a smooth talker with dead eyes and a gambling addiction that had cost him his house, his cars, and his children's respect. The last time I'd seen him was at my cousin's wedding 2 years ago, where he'd drunkenly cornered me near the bar, asking if I could loan him $50,000 for a sure-thing investment. When I politely declined, he'd sneered and muttered something about how I thought I was better than everyone else just because I had a fancy degree. I never imagined he would stoop so low as to prey on an elderly woman's vulnerability. The funeral was a surreal experience. Marcus played the grieving son perfectly, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief and speaking eloquently about Eleanor's generosity and wisdom. I sat in the front pew, numb with shock and grief, watching him accept condolences from family friends who had no idea what he'd done. When the service ended, he approached me with what I can only describe as predatory sympathy. "Sophia, sweetheart," he said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "I know you're probably disappointed about the will. Grandma Eleanor was getting confused toward the end, you know. Dementia runs in our family. She probably forgot about all those promises she made to you." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor had been sharp as a tack until the day she died. She could recall conversations from decades ago with perfect clarity, could still beat me at chess, and never forgot a single detail about my work or personal life. The suggestion that she had dementia was not just a lie, it was a desecration of her memory. "She didn't have dementia, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice barely controlled. "And we both know it." His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Grief can make us say things we don't mean, Sophia. I think it's best if we don't discuss this further. What's done is done." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Eleanor's words from our last conversation just a week before her death. She'd been excited about some renovations she wanted to make to the old barn on her property, talking about how I could convert it into a larger veterinary clinic once I inherited the land. She'd mentioned updating her will to include specific provisions for the animals she wanted me to care for, her 3 elderly cats and the injured hawk she'd been nursing back to health. None of this sounded like the ramblings of a confused woman. I decided to do what I should have done from the beginning: investigate. My first stop was Eleanor's longtime attorney, Robert Fairfield, whose family had handled our legal affairs for 3 generations. Mr. Fairfield was approaching 70 himself, a dignified man with silver hair and kind eyes who had always treated me like a daughter. When I arrived at his office, I could see the discomfort written across his weathered features. "Sophia," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of his leather chairs. "I was hoping you would come by. I have to admit, I was as surprised as anyone by the contents of Eleanor's final will." "Final will?" I leaned forward. "How many wills were there?" Mr. Fairfield opened a thick file on his desk. Your grandmother updated her will 3 times in the past 5 years. The first version, dated 4 years ago, left everything to you, as you probably expected. The second version, from 2 years ago, split the estate between you and your uncle Marcus, with you receiving the majority. The final version, signed just 2 months before her death, left everything to Marcus. My heart was pounding. Who was present when she signed the final will? That's where things get unusual, Mr. Fairfield said, his discomfort obvious. Typically, Eleanor would come to my office to handle her legal affairs. But for the final will, your uncle Marcus arranged for a different attorney to visit Eleanor at her home. A man named Thomas Brennan. I'd never heard of him before, and frankly, I was hurt that Eleanor didn't consult with me about such a significant change. Do you have this Thomas Brennan's contact information? Mr. Fairfield slid a business card across his desk. I looked him up after Eleanor's death. He's relatively new to the area, opened his practice just 6 months ago. Sophia, I have to ask, did Eleanor ever mention wanting to change her will? Did she express any concerns about your ability to handle the inheritance? Never, I said firmly. If anything, she seemed more excited than ever about leaving the property to me. She was making plans for improvements, talking about the future. Mr. Fairfield nodded grimly. I was afraid you'd say that. Sophia, I can't make any accusations, but if you suspect something improper occurred, you might want to consider hiring a private investigator. Will contests are difficult and expensive, but if there was fraud or undue influence... I left his office with Thomas Brennan's business card clutched in my hand and a growing certainty that Marcus had orchestrated the entire thing. But I needed proof, and I needed to understand exactly how he'd done it. My next stop was Eleanor's house. Marcus hadn't wasted any time. There was already a for sale sign on the front lawn. The realtor, a blonde woman in her 40s wearing an expensive suit, was just locking up when I pulled into the driveway. "Excuse me," I called out, jogging up the front walk. "I'm Sophia Chen, Eleanor Chen's granddaughter. Would it be possible for me to take one last look around the house?" The woman's expression softened. "Of course, dear. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your uncle mentioned that you were very close to Mrs. Chen. I'm Sandra Williams with Pacific Coast Realty." She unlocked the front door and gestured for me to enter. Walking through Eleanor's house was like stepping into a mausoleum. Marcus had already removed most of her personal belongings, leaving behind only the furniture that would help stage the house for sale. The walls that had once been covered with family photos now displayed generic artwork. The bookshelves that had held Eleanor's extensive collection of novels and memoirs now showcased decorator objects with no soul or history. "Your uncle worked very quickly to get the estate settled," Sandra said, perhaps sensing my distress. "He mentioned that your grandmother had been ill for some time and that he wanted to avoid a prolonged probate process." "Ill?" I turned to face her. "What exactly did he tell you about her condition?" Sandra looked uncomfortable. "Well, he said she'd been suffering from dementia for several months. He mentioned that toward the end, she sometimes didn't recognize family members or remember recent conversations. That's why he felt it was important to honor her final wishes quickly, before anyone could challenge her mental capacity." The lies just kept multiplying. I thanked Sandra and made my way upstairs to Eleanor's bedroom, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on what had happened in her final months. The room had been stripped bare except for the furniture, but I noticed that Eleanor's writing desk was still there, along with her reading chair and the small table where she kept her daily medications. I sat in her chair and tried to imagine what her final weeks had been like. Had Marcus visited regularly? Had he been pressuring her, wearing down her resistance? Or had he simply waited until she was vulnerable and then struck with surgical precision? As I was preparing to leave, something caught my eye. Eleanor's desk had a small drawer that was slightly ajar, so slightly that most people wouldn't have noticed. I pulled it open and found a single item, a small digital recorder, the kind Eleanor used to record voice memos when her arthritis made writing difficult. My hands trembled as I pressed the play button. Eleanor's voice filled the room, strong and clear. "Personal memo, October 15th. Marcus visited again today. This is the 4th time in 2 weeks, which is more than he's visited in the past 4 years combined. He keeps asking about my will. suggesting that Sophia is too young and inexperienced to handle the responsibility of the estate. He's wrong, of course. Sophia is the most responsible person I know, but Marcus seems desperate, almost frantic. He mentioned something about debts and said he needed to know that family would take care of family. I told him my will was already settled, but he became agitated and said that circumstances change, that I should consider what's really best for everyone. I don't like the way he's looking at me, like I'm a problem to be solved rather than his mother. I think I need to call Robert Fairfield. The recording continued with several more entries, each one documenting Marcus's increasingly aggressive visits. In the final entry, dated just 3 days before Eleanor's death, her voice was weaker, but still lucid. Marcus brought a lawyer today, a young man named Thomas something. They said there were tax implications to leaving the estate to Sophia that I hadn't considered, that I could save the family thousands of dollars by restructuring my will. The lawyer had all the papers already prepared. I told them I needed time to think. But Marcus said we should handle it immediately while I was feeling well. He said Sophia would understand, that she'd want what was best for the family. I don't know what to do. I'm so tired and they keep talking about numbers and taxes and legal complications. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm being selfish, thinking only about what I want instead of what's practical. I sat in that empty room, holding the recorder, and finally understood the full scope of Marcus's betrayal. He hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He had systematically manipulated and emotionally abused an elderly woman in the final weeks of her life. He had used her love for her family against her, convincing her that changing her will was an act of generosity rather than theft. But he had made one crucial mistake. He hadn't known about Eleanor's habit of recording her thoughts. That evening, I called the private investigator Mr. Fairfield had recommended, a former police detective named Maria Santos, who specialized in financial crimes and elder abuse. When I played Eleanor's recordings over the phone, her response was immediate and professional. Ms. Chen, what you've described constitutes elder abuse and quite possibly fraud. The recordings suggest a pattern of undue influence, and the fact that your uncle brought his own attorney with pre-prepared documents is extremely suspicious. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss our next steps. Maria Santos was a small, intense woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair. Her office was sparse and professional, decorated only with her detective credentials, and a few photos of her German Shepherd. She listened to Eleanor's recordings in their entirety, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. The good news, she said when the recordings finished, is that your grandmother documented a clear pattern of coercion. The bad news is that proving fraud in court is going to be challenging, especially since she did ultimately sign the new will. However, we have several avenues to explore. Over the next hour, Maria outlined her investigation plan. She would look into Thomas Brennan's background and professional history, examine the financial documents surrounding the will signing, and interview anyone who had contact with Eleanor in her final months. She would also investigate Marcus's financial situation to establish a motive for the fraud. I have to warn you, Maria said as our meeting concluded, that your uncle isn't going to take this investigation lying down. Once he realizes what we're doing, he may become hostile or try to intimidate you. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Eleanor's voice on those recordings, the confusion and sadness as she was manipulated into betraying her own wishes. He already stole everything that mattered to me, I said. I'm not afraid of him anymore. But I should have been. 3 days later, I arrived at my veterinary clinic to find Marcus waiting in the parking lot, leaning against a black SUV with tinted windows. He was dressed in an expensive suit that he certainly couldn't have afforded a month ago, and his smile had a predatory quality that made my skin crawl. "Good morning, Sophia," he said, pushing himself off the SUV as I approached. "Beautiful clinic. You've got here. Must have taken years to build up a practice like this. What do you want, Marcus? I hear you've been asking questions about Grandma Eleanor's will, talking to lawyers, hiring investigators." His smile never wavered, but his eyes were cold. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is that you thought you could get away with elder abuse and fraud." Marcus laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. "Fraud? Sophia, sweetheart, you're embarrassing yourself. Eleanor changed her will because she Realized you weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. She told me herself that you were too emotional, too impulsive to handle the estate properly. I have recordings that prove otherwise. For the first time, Marcus's composure cracked slightly. His smile flickered, and I saw a flash of genuine anger before he regained control. Recordings? What recordings? Eleanor documented your visits. Marcus. Every manipulation, every lie you told her. She recorded everything. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Lower, more dangerous. Sophia, I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making. You're talking about destroying your own family over money? Is that really who you want to be? You destroyed our family the moment you decided to prey on an elderly woman. Did I? Marcus stepped closer, and I could smell expensive cologne mixed with something else. Alcohol, maybe, or just the scent of desperation. Or did I save Eleanor from making a mistake? Do you have any idea what kind of tax burden that estate would have created? The inheritance taxes alone would have bankrupted you. I did you a favor. By stealing my inheritance? By preventing you from destroying yourself. His voice rose slightly, and I noticed that a few of my employees had arrived and were watching our confrontation from across the parking lot. You think you're so smart with your fancy degree and your successful little business, but you don't understand how the real world works. Money changes people, Sophia. It corrupts them. Eleanor knew that. That's why she changed her will. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app. Say that again, Marcus. Tell me again how Eleanor wanted to change her will. His face darkened. Put that away. Tell me how she called you and asked you to bring a lawyer to her house. Tell me how she begged you to help her cut me out of her will. I said put it away. Marcus's voice had dropped to a growl, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Or what? You'll abuse me the way you abused her? Marcus lunged forward and snatched the phone from my hands before I could react. He threw it to the ground and stomped on it with his heel, crushing the screen and sending pieces of plastic skittering across the asphalt. You just destroyed evidence in a criminal investigation, I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Marcus straightened his tie and smoothed his hair, his composure returning as quickly as it had disappeared. I destroyed a phone, nothing more. And Sophia, if you continue to spread these ridiculous accusations about me, you're going to find that I have resources you can't imagine. Resources that can make your life very, very difficult. He walked back to his SUV, pausing only to add, think very carefully about your next move. You might find that some battles aren't worth fighting. As I watched him drive away, I realized that Marcus had just made his second crucial mistake. He had threatened me in front of witnesses, and he had destroyed evidence while under investigation. Maria Santos was going to be very interested in hearing about this encounter, but more importantly, he had revealed something that would prove to be his downfall. He was scared. Desperate people make mistakes, and scared people make even bigger. Once I called Maria immediately and arranged to meet at her office that afternoon. When I described Marcus's visit and his destruction of my phone, her reaction was swift and professional. He just escalated this from a civil matter to a criminal one, she said, making notes on a legal pad. Intimidation of a witness and destruction of evidence are serious charges. But more importantly, his reaction tells us that we're on the right track. Innocent people don't threaten witnesses. What's our next move? Maria consulted her notes. I've been investigating Thomas Brennan, the attorney who handled Eleanor's final will. It turns out he's in serious financial trouble. His law practice is failing, and he owes significant money to several creditors. That gives him a strong motive to participate in fraudulent activities. She opened a file and spread several documents across her desk. I also obtained copies of the financial records from Eleanor's final months, 3 days before she signed the new will. Your uncle paid Thomas Brennan $5,000 for legal consulting services. That's an unusually high fee for a simple will modification. Can we prove that the payment was connected to the fraud? By itself, probably not, but combined with Eleanor's recordings and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the will signing, it's part of a pattern. Maria leaned back in her chair. I've also been looking into your uncle's finances. He's in debt up to his eyeballs, owes money to 3 different casinos, his mortgage company is threatening foreclosure, and his credit cards are maxed out. As of 2 months ago, he was facing personal bankruptcy. The pieces were finally coming together. Marcus hadn't just coveted Eleanor's money. He had desperately needed it to save himself from financial ruin. That desperation had driven him to commit elder abuse and fraud, but it had also made him sloppy. He had left a paper trail that a competent investigator could follow. There's one more thing, Maria said, pulling out a final document. I managed to track down one of the witnesses to Eleanor's final will signing, a woman named Janet Morrison who works as a part-time caregiver for elderly clients. She was hired by your uncle to look after Eleanor during her supposed illness. Maria handed me a transcript of her interview with Janet Morrison. As I read, my anger transformed into something colder and more focused. According to Janet, Marcus had hired her to visit Eleanor 3 times a week for the final month of her life, ostensibly to help with household tasks and medication management. But Eleanor hadn't needed significant help. She was managing fine, on her own. Instead, Marcus had instructed Janet to observe Eleanor carefully and to report back if she seemed confused or disoriented. He was building a case for her incompetence, I said, looking up from the transcript. Exactly. And Janet was uncomfortable with the arrangement from the beginning. She told me that Eleanor seemed perfectly lucid and capable, but that Marcus kept asking leading questions about her mental state. When the will was signed, Janet was present as a witness, but she told me that Eleanor seemed upset and kept asking if she was doing the right thing. I set down the transcript and looked at Maria directly. What do we need to do to nail him? We file a formal complaint with the police department and petition the court to invalidate the will based on undue influence and fraud. It's going to be a long process, and your uncle will fight back hard, but we have enough evidence to make a strong case. That night, I sat in my apartment surrounded by legal documents, financial records, and transcripts of Eleanor's recordings. For the first time since her death, I felt something other than grief and anger. I felt hope. Marcus had thought he was clever, but he had underestimated both Eleanor's foresight and my determination to see justice done. I poured myself a glass of wine and toasted my grandmother's memory. Don't worry, Eleanor, I said to the empty room. I'm going to make this right, but making it right would prove to be more complicated and dangerous than I had imagined. The next morning brought an unpleasant surprise. A letter from Marcus's new attorney, not Thomas Brennan, but a high-powered firm from downtown Portland. The letter was professionally worded but unmistakably threatening. It accused me of harassment, defamation, and malicious prosecution, and demanded that I cease all investigations into Eleanor's will immediately. If I failed to comply, the letter warned, Marcus would have no choice but to pursue legal action against me for damages to his reputation and emotional distress. The letter concluded with a paragraph that made my blood run cold. Mr. Chen is also concerned about the financial stability of your veterinary practice and would hate to see your professional reputation damaged by frivolous legal actions. As you well know, small businesses are fragile enterprises that can be destroyed by even unfounded rumors or accusations. It was a threat, thinly disguised as legal correspondence. Marcus was making it clear that if I continued to pursue the truth about Eleanor's will, he would try to destroy my veterinary practice. I called Maria immediately and read her the letter over the phone. Standard intimidation tactics, she said dismissively. The fact that he's hired expensive lawyers tells us that he's taking our investigation seriously. It also tells us that he's spending the money he stole from Eleanor's estate to fight us. What about his threat to go after my business? Empty posturing mostly. But Sophia, you should be prepared for him to try to damage your reputation. Narcissists and sociopaths don't accept defeat gracefully. As we get closer to exposing him, he's going to become more desperate and more dangerous. Maria's words proved prophetic. Over the next 2 weeks, I began noticing strange things happening around my veterinary clinic. Client appointments were mysteriously canceled, with several pet owners claiming they had received calls from my office rescheduling their visits. When I checked with my staff, no one had made those calls. Anonymous online reviews appeared on various websites accusing me of overcharging clients and providing substandard care. The reviews were clearly fake. They contained factual errors and used language that no real client would use, but they were damaging nonetheless. Most disturbing of all, I started receiving hang-up calls at all hours of the night. When I had my phone company trace the calls, they originated from different numbers each time, probably disposable cell phones or calling services. The caller never spoke, but I could hear breathing on the other end of the line. The message was clear. I was being watched, and my privacy was being violated. Marcus was waging a war of psychological attrition, trying to wear down my resolve and make me abandon my pursuit of justice. But his campaign of harassment only strengthened my determination to see him brought down. 3 weeks after filing our official complaint, Maria called with news that changed everything. "Sophia, you need to sit down for this," she said, her voice unusually excited. "Thomas Brennan just contacted my office. He wants to cooperate with our investigation." "What does that mean?" "It means he's willing to testify about what really happened when Eleanor signed that will. And Sophia, what he has to say is going to destroy your uncle's defense." We arranged to meet Thomas Brennan the next day at Maria's office. He was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. His hand shook slightly as he accepted the coffee Maria offered him, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Want to start by saying that I never intended for things to go this far," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When Marcus first approached me, he told me that his mother was suffering from dementia and that she needed help updating her will to reflect her current wishes. He said she had been making contradictory statements about her inheritance and that the family was concerned about her mental state." Brennan paused to take a sip of coffee, and I noticed that his hands were trembling. "He offered to pay me $5,000 to handle the will modification, which was much more than the usual fee. I should have been suspicious, but my practice was struggling and I needed the money." "What happened when you met Eleanor?" Maria asked. "That's when I realized that Marcus had lied to me. Eleanor wasn't suffering from dementia at all. She was sharp, articulate, and clearly competent. When I explained that I was there to help her modify her will, she seemed confused and upset. She kept saying that she had already discussed her will with her longtime attorney and that she didn't understand why changes were necessary." Brennan's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Marcus became increasingly aggressive, telling Eleanor that she was being selfish and that she needed to think about what was best for the family. He kept mentioning tax implications and legal complications that would burden Sophia if the will remained unchanged. Eleanor became more and more distressed, and finally agreed to sign the new will just to end the confrontation." "Did you believe that Eleanor was making an informed decision?" Maria asked. "No," Brennan said firmly. "She was clearly signing under duress. I should have stopped the process, but Marcus had already paid me, and he was very intimidating. He made it clear that if I didn't complete the will signing, there would be consequences for my career." "What kind of consequences?" Brennan looked down at his hands. "He said he had connections in the legal community and that he could make sure. I never got referrals from other attorneys. He also mentioned that he knew about some financial irregularities in my practice. Nothing criminal, just some tax issues that could have gotten me in trouble with the State Bar Association." "So he was blackmailing you," I said. "In essence, yes. I was trapped between my ethical obligations and my fear of professional destruction. I chose poorly, and I've regretted it every day since." Maria leaned forward. "Thomas, would you be willing to testify about this in court?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I can't undo what I did, but I can at least try to make it right. Your grandmother deserves justice, Ms. Chen, and your uncle deserves to face the consequences of what he did." After Thomas Brennan left, Maria and I sat in her office discussing the implications of his testimony. With his cooperation, we had a smoking gun, direct testimony from someone who had participated in the fraud and could describe Marcus's methods in detail. "This changes everything," Maria said. "We're no longer just alleging fraud based on circumstantial evidence. We have a witness who can describe exactly how the fraud was committed." When do we take this to the authorities? Immediately. I'm going to contact the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. With Brennan's testimony and Eleanor's recordings, we have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges against Marcus. That evening, I called my parents to update them on the investigation. My father, Eleanor's eldest son, had been supportive but cautious throughout the process. He loved his brother despite Marcus's flaws, and had hoped that the will dispute could be resolved without destroying the family. Sophia, he said after I explained Thomas Brennan's confession, are you sure you want to pursue criminal charges? This is going to tear our family apart. Dad, Marcus tore our family apart when he abused Eleanor. I'm just trying to put the pieces back together. But he's still family. Maybe there's a way to work this out privately, without involving the police. I understood my father's reluctance. Nobody wants to see their brother go to prison. But I also knew that Marcus's crimes couldn't be swept under the rug in the name of family harmony. Eleanor was family too, I said gently. She deserved better than what Marcus did to her, and if we don't hold him accountable, he'll just find another vulnerable person to victimize. My father was quiet for a long moment. You're right, he finally said. I just wish things could have been different. So do I, Dad. But Marcus made his choices, and now he has to live with the consequences. The next morning, Maria and I met with Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a seasoned prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse cases. She listened to Eleanor's recordings, reviewed Thomas Brennan's statement, and examined the financial evidence Maria had compiled. This is one of the strongest elder abuse cases I've seen, she said when we finished our presentation. You have documentation of the victim's mental competence, evidence of systematic coercion, witness testimony from the perpetrator's accomplice, and a clear financial motive. I'm prepared to file charges immediately. What charges are we talking about? I asked. Elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and possibly extortion, depending on what other evidence emerges. If convicted on all counts, your uncle could face 5 to 10 years in prison. As we left the district attorney's office, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. We had finally reached the point where Marcus would face justice for his crimes, but I knew that his arrest would mark the beginning of a new and potentially more dangerous phase of our conflict. I didn't have to wait long to find out how right I was. 2 days later, I was working late at my clinic when I heard a noise outside, the sound of breaking glass. I looked out the window and saw that someone had thrown a brick through the windshield of my car. Attached to the brick was a note written in block letters. Drop the charges or your business is next. I called the police immediately, and they took a report and collected the brick and note as evidence. But I knew that proving Marcus was responsible would be nearly impossible. He was too smart to leave fingerprints or other physical evidence, and he probably had alibis for his whereabouts. Thus, harassment escalated over the next week. Someone spray-painted "liar" across the front window of my clinic. My business website was hacked, and the homepage was replaced with accusations that I was a fraud who cared more about money than animals. Several of my longtime clients received anonymous letters claiming that I was under investigation for malpractice. But Marcus's biggest mistake came when he decided to target my staff. My veterinary assistant, Jennifer, had been with me for 5 years and was like a younger sister to me. She was dedicated, compassionate, and beloved by our clients. One morning, she came to work in tears, carrying a manila envelope that had been left on her apartment door. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice shaking, "someone left this for me, and I don't understand what it means." Inside the envelope were photocopies of Jennifer's college transcripts, her apartment lease, her car registration, and her student loan documents. There was also a note. People who work for liars sometimes find themselves in difficult situations. Financial problems, academic problems, personal problems. Think carefully about your loyalties. It was a clear threat to destroy Jennifer's life if she continued to work for me, and it was the final straw. I called Maria immediately and arranged an emergency meeting with Ada Walsh. When I showed them the materials that had been left for Jennifer, their reaction was swift and decisive. "This crosses a line," Ada Walsh said. "Intimidating witnesses is a serious felony, and targeting an innocent third party shows a level of maliciousness that goes beyond typical family disputes. I'm going to ask for a warrant for your uncle's arrest today." "What about Jennifer's safety?" I asked. We'll provide protection for both of you until your uncle is in custody. And Sophia, I think it's time to consider a restraining order as well." The next morning, I watched from my clinic window as 2 police cars pulled up to the building across the street where Marcus had been conducting his surveillance. I hadn't known he was there, but Ada Walsh had suspected that the harassment was too well coordinated to be random. They had been watching him for 2 days, documenting his activities and waiting for the right moment to make an arrest. Marcus emerged from the building wearing the same expensive suit he had worn during our parking lot confrontation. Even from a distance, I could see his shock and anger as the officers approached him with handcuffs. He tried to maintain his composure, gesturing calmly and speaking in measured tones, but the officers weren't interested in conversation. As they led him to the police car, Marcus looked directly at my clinic window. Even from across the street, I could feel the intensity of his hatred. He mouthed something that I couldn't make out, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Marcus was in custody, Eleanor's voice recordings were safe, and Thomas Brennan was cooperating with the authorities. Justice was finally within reach. The trial began 4 months later, on a gray February morning that reminded me of the day Eleanor had died. The courthouse was packed with family members, reporters, and members of the community who had followed the case in the local newspapers. Marcus sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, his expensive lawyer whispering urgently. In his ear, Ada Walsh had prepared meticulously for the trial. She presented Eleanor's recordings as the centerpiece of her case, playing each entry for the jury and providing context about the systematic manipulation they documented. Thomas Brennan testified about the fraudulent will signing, describing in detail how Marcus had pressured both him and Eleanor into participating in the scheme. The financial evidence was equally damning. Walsh showed the jury records of Marcus's debts, his desperate financial situation, and the suspicious payment to Thomas Brennan just days before Eleanor's death. She painted a picture of a man who had targeted his own mother in a calculated scheme to steal her life savings. Marcus's defense attorney tried to portray him as a loving son who had been trying to protect his mother from making a mistake. He argued that Eleanor had genuinely wanted to change her will, and that Marcus had simply helped her find an attorney to handle the modification. But the defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The most powerful moment came when Ada Walsh played Eleanor's final recording for the jury. Her voice, weak but still lucid, filled the courtroom as she described her confusion and distress about the will change. You could hear the pain in her words as she wondered if she was being selfish, if she should trust her instincts or bow to Marcus's pressure. Several jurors were visibly moved, and I saw one elderly woman wipe tears from her eyes. Eleanor wasn't just a victim in an abstract legal case. She was someone's grandmother, someone's mother, someone who had been betrayed by the person who should have protected her most. Marcus's attorney called him to testify in his own defense, which proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Under cross-examination, Ada Walsh methodically dismantled his story. She played recordings of his phone calls from jail, where he had been caught coaching potential witnesses and trying to discredit Thomas Brennan's testimony. She presented evidence of the harassment campaign against me and my staff, showing the jury exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The turning point came when Walsh asked Marcus directly about Eleanor's mental state in her final weeks. "You've testified that your mother was confused and forgetful," Walsh said, consulting her notes. Yet she was still living independently, managing her own finances and maintaining correspondence with friends and family. "Can you explain this contradiction?" Marcus's composure finally cracked. "She was good at hiding it," he said, his voice rising. "She didn't want people to know she was losing her mind. But I could see it. I was the only one who could see what was really happening to her. So everyone else was wrong? Her doctor, her longtime attorney, her neighbors, her granddaughter who visited every week. They were all fooled. But you could see the truth?" "Yes," Marcus said defiantly. "Because I cared about her more than anyone else did. I was trying to protect her from making a mistake that would have destroyed Sophia's life." Walsh smiled coldly. "If you cared so much about protecting your mother and niece, why did you pay Thomas Brennan $5,000 to expedite a will change that your mother clearly didn't want to make?" Marcus realized his mistake too late. His face went pale, and he stammered something about legal fees and proper procedures. But the damage was done. He had just admitted to paying for a service that any competent attorney would have provided, for a fraction of that cost. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and delivered guilty verdicts on all charges: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, witness intimidation, and harassment. Marcus showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but I saw his hands clench into fists on the table in front of him. Judge Patricia Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month and remanded Marcus to custody without bail. As the bailiff led him away, he looked back at me one final time. But instead of hatred, I saw something different in his eyes: defeat, and perhaps the first glimmer of understanding about what he had lost. The sentencing hearing was smaller and quieter than the trial. Ada Walsh recommended the maximum sentence under the guidelines, citing the vulnerability of the victim and the defendant's lack of remorse. Marcus's attorney argued for leniency, claiming that his client was a good man who had made poor choices, under extreme financial pressure. Judge Morrison listened to both arguments and then asked if anyone wanted to make a victim impact statement. I had prepared for this moment for months, writing and rewriting my words until they captured everything I needed to say. "Your Honor," I began, standing at the podium with Eleanor's photo in my hands. "My grandmother, Eleanor Chen, was the strongest, kindest, most generous person I ever knew. She survived the Great Depression, raised 6 children as a single mother, and built a life based on hard work, integrity, and love for her family. Marcus Chen didn't just steal her money. He stole her peace of mind in the final weeks of her life. He made her doubt her own judgment, question her love for me, and worry that she was being selfish for wanting to fulfill a promise she had made years earlier. He turned her generosity and love for her family into weapons to use against her. The KHR recordings we heard during this trial capture only a fraction of Eleanor's suffering. In those final weeks, she called me several times, confused and upset about Marcus's visits. She asked me if I thought she was a bad grandmother for considering changes to her will. I assured her that she should do whatever felt right to her, never knowing that she was being systematically manipulated and coerced. Marcus robbed Eleanor of the dignity she deserved in her final days. He robbed me of my inheritance, yes. But, more importantly, he robbed both of us of our trust in family. Our belief that blood relationships mean something more than financial opportunity. I'm not asking for revenge, Your Honor. I'm asking for justice. Eleanor can't speak for herself anymore, but her voice lives on in those recordings. She trusted her family to protect her, and we failed her. The least we can do now is ensure that her abuser faces the full consequences of his crimes. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. She looked at Marcus, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, showing no sign of remorse or accountability. "Mr. Chen," she said finally, "in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that combines such calculating cruelty with such fundamental betrayal of trust. You targeted the most vulnerable member of your own family, exploited her love and generosity, and caused immeasurable suffering in her final weeks of life. Your actions weren't the result of a momentary lapse in judgment or overwhelming circumstances. They were part of a deliberate, sustained campaign of elder abuse that continued even after your mother's death, when you attempted to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. The court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay full restitution of $2.3 million to Ms. Chen, representing the value of the estate you fraudulently obtained, plus interest and legal fees." As the judge's words sank in, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death: peace. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that the universe had been rebalanced, that justice had finally been served. Marcus was led away in shackles, his expensive suit replaced by prison garb, his arrogant swagger reduced to the shuffling gait of a convicted felon. He didn't look back this time, and I was grateful for that small mercy. The legal process wasn't quite finished. There were still civil proceedings to restore Eleanor's original will and transfer the estate back to me, but the criminal case was closed. Marcus would spend the next 8 years behind bars, thinking about what his greed and cruelty had cost him. 6 months later, I stood in Eleanor's garden, watching contractors restore the old barn that she had wanted me to convert into an expanded veterinary clinic. The property had finally been returned to me, along with most of the money Marcus had stolen. He had managed to spend several $100,000 during his brief ownership, but the bulk of Eleanor's estate was intact. Had decided to honor Eleanor's wishes exactly as she had expressed them in our final conversations. The barn would become a wildlife rehabilitation center, focusing on injured raptors like the hawk she had been nursing when she died. The main house would be converted into a sanctuary for elderly animals whose owners could no longer care for them. It felt like the right way to remember her, not with monuments or memorials, but with living tributes to her compassion and love for all creatures. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus was denied parole at his first hearing. The board cited lack of remorse and concerns about reoffending. See you at the civil settlement next month. I smiled and put the phone away. Justice had been served, but more importantly, Eleanor's legacy would live on in ways that Marcus could never touch or taint. He had tried to reduce her life to dollars and cents, but her true value couldn't be measured in financial terms. As the sun set over the mountains, I heard the cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, perhaps a descendant of the bird Eleanor had been caring for. It was a sound she had always loved, wild and free and utterly untamable. That evening, I called my parents to update them on the property restoration. My father, who had struggled with guilt over Marcus's crimes, was finally beginning to heal from the trauma of watching his brother's downfall. "You did the right thing, Sophia," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know it wasn't easy to turn against family, but Marcus stopped being family the moment he decided to hurt Eleanor." "I never turned against family, Dad," I replied. "I stood up for family. Eleanor was family. Her memory was family. What Marcus did was turn against all of us. Your grandmother would be proud of you. She always said you had more strength than you knew." After we hung up, I walked through Eleanor's house one more time before heading home to my apartment. The rooms were empty now, waiting for renovation, but I could still feel her presence in every corner. She had filled this house with love and laughter for 60 years, and no amount of betrayal or greed could erase that legacy. I paused in her bedroom, where I had first found the digital recorder that had changed everything. Without those recordings, Marcus might have gotten away with his crimes. Eleanor had unknowingly provided the evidence needed to bring him to justice, even after death. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty room, "for everything." Over the following year, Eleanor's property was transformed into exactly what she had envisioned. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center opened with a ceremony attended by veterinarians, conservationists, and community members who had known and loved Eleanor. The elderly animal sanctuary became a haven for pets whose owners had died or could no longer provide care. I moved into the renovated main house, finally feeling like I was truly home. Every morning, I would walk through Eleanor's garden, tending the flowers she had planted and listening to the sounds of the animals in our care. Red-tailed hawks nested in the oak trees at the edge of the property, and their cries reminded me daily of the woman who had made all of this possible. Marcus served his full 8-year sentence without parole. I heard occasionally from other family members that he had tried to contact them from prison, always maintaining his innocence and claiming that I had orchestrated a conspiracy against him. But his letters grew less frequent over the years, and eventually stopped altogether. When he was finally released, he was a broken man in his 50s with no money, no family support, and a criminal record that made employment difficult. He moved to another state, and I never heard from him again. Sometimes I wondered if he had ever truly understood what he had lost, not just money or freedom, but the love and respect of everyone who had once cared about him. The civil court had awarded me everything, Eleanor's full estate, plus damages for the emotional distress Marcus had caused. But the money, while important, was never the real victory. The real victory was knowing that Eleanor's final wishes had been honored, that her abuser had been held accountable, and that her legacy would live on in the lives we saved at the sanctuary. 5. Years after Eleanor's death, I received an unexpected visitor at the Wildlife Center. Thomas Brennan, the attorney who had helped Marcus commit fraud but then testified against him, stood at my office door looking older and more weathered than I remembered. "Ms. Chen," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you don't mind me coming by. I wanted to see what you had done with your grandmother's property." I invited him in and gave him a tour of the facilities. He was particularly interested in the rehabilitation center, asking detailed questions about our methods and success rates. As we walked through the flight enclosures where recovering raptors practiced using their wings, he seemed genuinely moved by what he saw. "This is beautiful," he said, watching a young osprey take its first flight since recovering from a wing injury. "Your grandmother would have loved this." "She did love it," I replied. "This was her dream, not just mine." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Chen, I've carried a tremendous amount of guilt about my role in your uncle's crimes. I know that testifying against him was the right thing to do, but it doesn't undo the pain I helped cause." "No, it doesn't," I said honestly. "But it prevented him from getting away with it. That matters. I've thought about your grandmother often over the years. In the brief time I spent with her, I could see that she was a remarkable woman. She didn't deserve what happened to her. No one deserves what Marcus did to her. But you made the choice to do the right thing in the end. That's what matters now." Thomas nodded, tears in his eyes. "I've been volunteering at a legal aid clinic, providing free services to elderly clients. It's my way of trying to make amends. I'll never practice estate law again, but I can still help people in other ways." After he left, I sat in Eleanor's favorite spot in the garden and thought about the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. Marcus's betrayal had destroyed our family's trust and innocence, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience that Eleanor had tried to teach me throughout my life. She had always said that our character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of crisis. The crisis Marcus created had tested all of us, and while some had failed that test, others had risen to meet it with courage and integrity. As the sun set over the mountains, I heard the familiar cry of the red-tailed hawks returning to their roost in Eleanor's oak trees. They had built their nest in the same tree where she used to sit and watch the sunset, and their presence felt like her blessing on everything we had accomplished. I pulled out my phone and called my father, as I did every evening, to check on him and share news about the sanctuary. He had become one of our most dedicated volunteers, finding peace and purpose in caring for the animals Eleanor had loved. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good, Dad, really good." Eleanor's hawks had babies this spring, 3 healthy chicks that are just starting to learn to fly. She would have been so excited to see that. You know, I think she's watching over all of us from wherever she is now. "I think so too, Dad. I think so too." As I hung up and prepared to head inside for the night, I reflected on the lessons Eleanor's story had taught me. Betrayal is a terrible thing. It shatters trust, destroys relationships, and leaves wounds that never fully heal. But it can also teach us who we really are and what we're capable of when everything we love is threatened. Marcus had thought that family loyalty meant covering up crimes and enabling bad behavior. He had expected us to stay silent, to choose peace over justice, to value family reputation more than family integrity. But he had fundamentally misunderstood what family really means. Real family loyalty isn't about protecting people from the consequences of their actions. It's about loving them enough to hold them accountable when they lose their way. It's about standing up for the vulnerable members of the family, even when that means standing against the powerful ones. It's about honoring the memory and wishes of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Eleanor had trusted me to carry on her legacy, and I had done exactly that. Not just by inheriting her property or her money, but by fighting for her dignity and ensuring that her voice was heard even after death. Marcus had tried to silence her, to reduce her to a confused old woman whose wishes didn't matter, but her recordings had given her the final word. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was thriving. The elderly animal sanctuary was saving lives. Every day, and Eleanor's property had become exactly what she had dreamed it could be. Marcus had spent 8 years in prison thinking about what his greed had cost him, but he would never understand the real loss. The loss of love, respect, and family connection that no amount of money could ever restore. I walked through the garden one final time, checking on the animals in our care and making sure everything was secure for the night. In the distance, I could see the lights of Portland twinkling like stars, and I thought about all the families out there facing their own crises, their own betrayals, their own moments of truth. Some would choose the easy path, the path of silence and complicity. Others would choose the harder path, the path of truth and accountability. I hoped that Eleanor's story might inspire even one person to stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost. As I locked the front door and turned off the lights, I whispered the same words I had spoken every night since moving into Eleanor's house. Thank you for trusting me with your legacy. I promise to keep it safe. The red-tailed hawks called softly from their roost in the oak trees, and I smiled as I headed upstairs to bed. Eleanor's voice lived on in the wind through the trees, in the cries of the wild creatures she had loved, and in the knowledge that justice, though sometimes delayed, would always find its way home. In the end, Marcus had gotten exactly what he deserved, not revenge, but consequences. And Eleanor had gotten exactly what she deserved, a legacy that would outlive all of us, built on love, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to doing what's right. That was the kind of inheritance that could never be stolen, no matter how clever the thief or how carefully planned the betrayal. It was written not in legal documents, but in the hearts of everyone whose life had been touched by Eleanor's kindness, and it would endure long after Marcus's crimes were forgotten, a testament to the truth that love is always stronger than greed. And that family, real family, is built on loyalty to principles, not people. The price of blood, I had learned, isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in trust, integrity, and the courage to do what's right, even when it costs everything you thought you cared about. Eleanor had paid that price willingly throughout her life, and she had taught me to do the same. It was the most valuable inheritance she could have given me, more precious than any house, any bank account, or any material possession. As I drifted off to sleep in the house where Eleanor had lived and dreamed and planned for my future, I felt her presence surrounding me like a warm embrace. She was at peace now, knowing that her story had been told, her abuser had been punished, and her legacy would live on. And in the morning, I would wake up and continue the work she had started, caring for creatures who couldn't care for themselves, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and standing up for what's right regardless of the cost. That was Eleanor's gift to me, and Marcus's betrayal, paradoxically, had been the catalyst that helped me find the strength to claim it.